Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Bad Company by Walter de la Mare. It's very seldom that one encounters what would appear to be sheer, unadulterated evil in a human face. An evil, I mean, active, deliberate, deadly, dangerous. Folly, heedlessness, vanity, pride, craft, meanness, stupidity, yes. But even Iagos in this world are few, and devilry is as rare as witchcraft. One winter's evening some little time ago, bound on a visit to a friend in London, I found myself on the platform of one of its many subterranean railway stations. It is an ordeal that one may undergo as seldom as one can. The glare and glitter, the noise, the very air one breathes affects nerves and spirits. One expects vaguely strange meetings in such surroundings. On this occasion, the expectation was justified. The mind is at times more attentive than the eye, already tired and troubled with personal cares and problems which a little wisdom and enterprise should have refused to entertain. I had seated myself on one of the low wooden benches to the left of the entrance to the platform, when, for no conscious reason, I was prompted to turn my head in the direction of a fellow traveller seated across the gangway on the fellow to my bench some few yards away. What was wrong with him? He was enveloped in a loose cape or cloak, sombre and motionless. He appeared to be wholly unaware of my abrupt scrutiny. And yet I doubted, for the next moment, although the door of the nearest coach gaped immediately opposite him, he'd shuffled into the compartment I had entered myself, and now in its corner confronted me, all but knee to knee. I could have touched him with my hand. We had, too, come at once into an even more intimate contact than that of touch. Our eyes, his own fixed in a dwelling and lethargic state, had instantly met, and no less rapidly mine had uncharitably recoiled, not only in misgiving, but in something little short of disgust. The effect resembled that of an acid on milk, and, for the time being, cast my thoughts into confusion. Yet that one glance had taken him in. He was old, but over 70. A wide-brimmed, rusty and dusty black hat concealed his head, a head fringed with wisps of hair, lank and paper-grey. His loose, jaded cheeks were of the colour of putty, the thin lips above the wide, unshaven and dimpled chin showing scarcely a trace of red. The cloak, suspended from his shoulders, mantled him to his shins. One knuckled, cadaverous, mittened hand clasped a thick ash stick, its handle black and polished with long usage. The only sign of life in his countenance was secreted in his eyes, fixed on mine, hazed and dully glistening, as a snail in winter is fixed to a wall. There was a dull, deliberate challenge in them, and, as I fancied, something more than that. They suggested that he had been in wait for me, that for him it was almost well met. For minutes together I endeavoured to accept their challenge, to make sure, yet I realized, fascinated the while, that he was well aware of the futility of this attempt, as a snake is of the restless fated bird in the branches above its head. Such a statement, I am aware, must appear wildly exaggerated, but I can only record my impressions. It was already latish, much later than I'd intended. The passengers came and went, and, whether intentionally or not, none consented to occupy the seat vacant beside him. I fixed my eyes on an advertisement, that of a friendly society, I remember, immediately above his head, with the intention of watching him in the field of an eye that I could not persuade to meet his own in full focus again. He had instantly detected this ingenious device. By a fraction of an inch he had shifted his grasp upon his stick. So intolerable at length became the physical and psychical effect of his presence on me that I determined to leave the train at the next station, and there to await the next. At this precise moment I was conscious that he had not only withdrawn his eyes, but closed them. I was not so easily to free myself of his company. A glance over my shoulder as, after leaving the train, I turned towards the lift showed him hastily groping his way out of the carriage. The metal gate clanged. The lift slid upwards, and, such is the contrariness of human nature, a faint disappointment followed. One may, for example, be appalled and yet engrossed in reading an account of some infamous cruelty. Concealing myself as best as I could at the bookstall, I awaited the next lift load. Its few passengers having dispersed, he himself followed. In spite of age and infirmity, he had then ascended alone the spiral staircase. Glancing, it appeared, neither to right nor left, he passed rapidly through the barrier, and yet had he not seen me? The ticket collector raised his head, opened his mouth, watched his retreating figure, but made no attempt to retrieve his. It was dark now, the dark of London. In my absence underground, minute frozen pellets of snow had fallen, whitening the streets and lulling the sound of the traffic. On emerging into the street, he turned in the direction of the next station, my own. Yet again, had he or had he not been aware that he was being watched? However that might be, my journey lay his way, and that way my feet directed me, although I was already later than I'd intended. I followed him, led on no doubt in part merely by the effect he'd had on me. Some 20 or 30 yards ahead, his dark shapelessness showed distinct against the whitening pavement. The waters of the Thames, I was aware, lay on my left. A muffled blast from the siren of a tug announced its presence. Keeping my distance, I followed him on. 1 lamppost, 2, 3. At that he seemed to pause for a moment as if to listen, momentarily glanced back, as I fancied, and vanished. When I came up with it, I found that this 3rd lamppost vaguely illuminated the mouth of a narrow, lightless alley between highish walls. It led me, after a while, into another alley, yet dingier. The wall on the left of this was evidently that of a large garden. On the right came a row of nondescript houses, looming up in their neglect against the starless sky. The first of these houses appeared to be occupied. The next 2 were vacant. Dingy curtains, soot grey against their snowy windowsills, hung over the next. A litter of paper and refuse, abandoned by the last long gust of wind that must have come whistling round the nearer angle of the house, lay under the broken flight of steps up to a mid-Victorian porch. The small snow clinging to the bricks and to the worn and weathered cement of the wall only added to its gaunt lifelessness. In the faint hope of other company coming my way, and vowing that I would follow no further than to the outlet of yet another pitch-black and uninviting alley or court, which might indeed prove to be a dead end, I turned into it. It was then that I observed, in the rays of the lamp over my head, that in spite of the fineness of the snow and the brief time that had elapsed, there seemed to be no trace on its surface of recent footsteps. A faintly thudding echo accompanied me on my way. I found it very useful, in the country, always to carry a small electric torch in my greatcoat pocket, but for the time being I refrained from using it. This alley proved not to be blind. Beyond, a patch of waste ground, a nebulous leaden-grey vacancy marked a loop here of the Thames. I decided to go no further, and then perceived a garden gate in the wall to my right. It was ajar, but could not long have been so, because no more than an instant's flash of my torch showed marks in the snow of its recent shifting, and yet there was little wind. On the other hand, here was the open river. Just a breath of a breeze across its surface might account for this. The cracked and blistered paint was shimmering with a thin coat of rime, of hoarfrost, and, as if a finger had just now scrawled it there, a clumsy arrow showed, its V pointing inward. A tramp, an errand boy, a mere accident might have accounted for this. It may indeed have been a mark made some time before on the paint. I paused in an absurd debate with myself, chiefly, I think, because I felt some little alarm at the thought of what might follow, yet led on also by the conviction that I had been intended, decoyed, to follow. I pushed the gate a little wider open, peered in, and made my way up a woody path beneath ragged, unpruned and leafless fruit trees towards the house. The snow's own light revealed a ramshackle flight of steps up to a poor Frenchified sort of canopy above French windows, one half of their glazed doors ajar. I ascended and peered into the intense gloom beyond it, and thus and then prepared to retrace my steps as quickly as possible. I called, in tones as near those of a London policeman as I could manage, "Hello, is there anything wrong? Is anyone wanted?" After all, I could at least explain to my fellow passenger, if he appeared, that I found both his gate and his window open, and the house was hardly pleasantly situated. No answer was returned to me. In doubt and disquietude, but with a conviction that all was not well, I flashed my torch over the walls and furniture of the room and its heavily framed pictures. How could anything be well, with unseen company such as this besieging one's senses? Ease and pleasant companionship the room may once have been capable of giving. In its dirt, cold, and neglect, it showed nothing of that now. I crossed it, paused again in the passage beyond it, and listened. I then entered the room beyond that. Venetian blinds, many of the slats of which had outworn their webbing, and heavy crimson chenille side curtains concealed its windows. The ashes of a fire showed beyond rusty bars of the grate under a black marble mantelpiece. An oil lamp on the table with a green shade exuded a stink of paraffin. Beyond was a table littered with books and papers, and an overturned chair. There I could see the bent-up old legs, perceptibly lean beneath the trousers, of the occupant of the room. In no doubt of whose remains these were, I drew near, and with bared teeth and icy trembling fingers drew back the fold of the cloak that lay over the face. Death has a strange sorcery. A shuddering revulsion of feeling took possession of me. This cold, once genteel, hideous, malignant room, and this. The skin of the blue loose cheek was drawn tight over the bone. The mouth lay a little open, showing the dislodged false teeth beneath. The dull, unspeculative eyes stared out from beneath lowered lids towards the black mouth of the chimney above the fireplace. Vileness and iniquity had left their marks on the lifeless features, and yet it was rather with compassion than with horror and disgust that I stood regarding them. What desolate solitude, what misery must this old man, abandoned to himself, have experienced during the last years of his life, encountering nothing but enmity and the apprehension of his fellow creatures. I am not intending to excuse or even commiserate what I cannot understand, but the most complete absence of any goodness in the human spirit cannot but condemn the heart to an appalling isolation. Had he been murdered, or had he come to a violent but natural end? In either case, horror and terror must have supervened. That I had been enticed, deliberately led on to this discovery, I hadn't the least doubt, extravagant though this too may seem. Why? What for? I couldn't bring myself to attempt to light the lamp. Besides, in that last vigil it must have burnt itself out. My torch revealed a stub of candle on the mantelpiece. I lit that. He seemed to have been engaged in writing when the enemy of us all had approached him in silence and had struck him down. A long and unsealed envelope lay on the table. I drew out the contents, a letter and a will which had been witnessed some few weeks before, apparently by a tradesman's boy and possibly by some derelict charwoman, Eliza Hinks. I knew enough about such things to be sure that the will was valid and complete. This old man had been evidently more than fairly rich in this world's goods, and reluctant to surrender them. The letter was addressed to his two sisters, to my two sisters, Amelia and Maud. Standing there in the cold and the silence, and utterly alone, for if any occupant of the other world had decoyed me there was not the faintest hint in consciousness that he or his influence was any longer present with me, I read the vilest letter that has ever come my way. Even in print, it stated that he knew the circumstances of these two remaining relatives, that he was well aware of their poverty and physical conditions. One of them, it seemed, was afflicted with cancer. He had then proceeded to explain that although they should, by the intention of their mother, have had a due share in her property and in the money she had left, it rejoiced him to think that his withholding of this knowledge must continually have added to their wretchedness. Why he so hated them was only vaguely suggested. The will he had enclosed with the letter left all that he died possessed of to, of all human establishments that need it least, the authorities of Scotland Yard. It was to be devoted, it ran, to the detection of such evildoers as are ignorant or imbecile enough to leave their misdemeanours and crimes detectable. It said that confession is good for the soul. Well then, as publicly as possible, I take this opportunity of announcing that there and then I made a little heap of envelope, letter and will on the hearth, and put a match to them. When every vestige of the paper had been consumed, I stamped the ashes down. I had touched nothing else. I would leave the vile, jaded, forsaken house to reveal its own secret, and I might ensure that that would not be long delayed. What continues to perplex me is that so far as I can see, no other agency but that of this evil old recluse himself had led me to my discovery. Why? Can it have been with this very intention? I stooped down and peeped and peered narrowly in under the lowered lids in the light of my torch, but not the feeblest flicker, remotest signal, or faintest syllabling echo of any message rewarded me. Dead fish are less unseemly. And yet, well, we are all of us, I suppose, at any extreme capable of remorse, and not utterly shut against repentance. Is it possible that this priceless blessing is not denied us even when all that's earthly else appear to have come to an end?
If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past.
Well, that was Bad Company by Walter de la Mare. I'm going to talk a bit about the story. I'm going to talk a bit about him. I must admit that Walter de la Mare is a guy who's fascinated me for a long time. One of my favourite books I'm looking at here, which I used to read from on the Sleep podcast I did, Behold This Dreamer by Walter de la Mare. Fantastic kind of anthology. I love his way of approaching the world. I'm going to say something about him and probably it might become evident why. So, he's not your obvious. I mean, he has his creaking floorboards, clanking chains, and spectral visitations. He does have those, and if he didn't have those, I probably wouldn't like him as much. But, he is one of these ghost story writers that convey supernatural terror through suggestion rather than statement. And they don't necessarily explain themselves in many cases. In fact, I can't think of any of these stories that tie themselves up with a bow at the end and go, and that, dear readers, is that, and I know there is a remarkable, let's think about how fiction works. Why you read a book, why you keep turning the pages, because the author has created questions in your mind. It's just really simple. It's not voodoo. It's really simple. So you always have what happened, right? And that leads the reader, the listener, to want to have, and this is what happened. And this is why we want everything tied up at the end of a story. And it's been a device of supernatural fiction authors, particularly, probably because of the nature of the supernatural, which is open-ended. I mean, many of you won't believe in the supernatural. Those of you who do probably don't really understand what's going on. So, it may be that nothing's going on, it may be, but there are open questions, aren't there? And perhaps because of that, not like science fiction, not like I mean, detective stories don't do this. They tie everything up. Science fiction stories, murder stories, love stories. They either end bittersweet or bittersweet bitter, or bit just bitter. Um, but supernatural stories very often, particularly something like M.R. James, resist doing this. Robert Aikman, of course, Walter de la Mare as well. They do not give you a nice little, and this reader is the explanation of that. This story, to an extent, gets pretty close to that. I think it gets pretty close to a resolution. It's one of his latest stories. So let's say something about him. He was born in 1873 to a family. His father's family were French Huguenots. Had been in out of France for quite a while. Obviously, the Huguenots were the Protestants who were persecuted by the French king. So they'd been out of, and there were merchants, tended to be merchants, and they were welcomed, particularly in the Low Countries and in England. But, hence the de la Mare name. His mother's family were surgeons, were Scottish and were surgeons. Okay, so he was born in 1873. Let me see. His father was clerk to the insolvent. No, that's me. Right. I'm getting myself all mixed up here. There's too many people involved in this. So the way I've done this is I've put my notes all out of order. So he was born at 83 Marion Road, Charlton, then in Kent, now part of Greenwich, to James Edward de la Mare, 1811-1877, who was a principal at the Bank of England. So he was fairly significant in society and not a poor man. His father came from French Huguenot silk merchant stock, which, as my note says, explains the continental surname and perhaps some of that aesthetic sensibility. Does it, though? Do we really claim that with any sensibility? Do we say that, if your great-great-grandfather was a silk merchant and then you paint that this is due to his sense? Well, maybe it is. Funnily enough, in my family, my great-grandfather, my maternal, one of them, great-grandfathers, was into amateur dramatics. And he was a roofer. He was that was his business point. That's not very theatrical, but he used to go around apparently in the 20s to village halls putting on skits. I don't know if it was skits, but adaptations of Shakespeare. And then on the other side, of course, my paternal thing. My grandfather there was a very talented artist. And these are so and then my daughter did fine art and is an artist, and my cousin is a graphic designer, and I can't draw to save my life, but so maybe it is the silk merchant ancestry which created all this diaphanous stuff that he writes. So that was his mother. His mother, Lucy Sophia Browning, was not related to the Barrett Browning. Was not related, although it is repeated, but it's not. And Robert Browning, it's the poet. It's not correct. Browning is a fairly common name. Her father was a naval surgeon from Scotland, Dr. Colin Arrett Browning. The medical and literary combination in his maternal grandfather is striking. A naval surgeon who he also wrote suggests someone comfortable navigating between empirical observation and imaginative expression. I don't know where I get these ideas from. Well, we do, don't we? So, very interesting thing about him. Oh yeah, they grew up in a house in Annerley in South London. Weirdly, I used to live on Annerley Road. What? Yeah, by the time I lived, and it was a nice in the early Victorian period. It was a very middle class sort of place. It was heading towards Ruskin's territory out that way in southeast London, but by the time I lived there, it was a bit more down at heel. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't a deadly dangerous neighbourhood at all, but it was a poor white working class area. I don't know what it is now, but yeah, I didn't love it though. It was slightly edgy sometimes at night. It was a tough sort of place, but it wasn't terrible. You weren't going to get shot or anything like that. So okay. There we are, Annerley. Well, and they used to play charades, so there's this theatrical side to them. When he was young, he joined in 1892 He joined the Esperanza Amateur Dramatics Club. Now let's work out. So he'd be 19, where he met and fell in love with Elfrida Inkpen, the leading lady, who was 10 years older than him. But they married in 1899 and had 4 children. Richard Herbert Inkpen suggests that he might have been from a previous relationship, maybe illegitimate, given that he's kept his mother's name. And then Colin, Florence, and Lucy Elfrida Delamere. Elfrida was not a public figure in that sense, but she was an accomplished amateur actress. She was a leading lady in this Wandsworth Amateur Dramatics Club. And her father... So there's some story that she appears in portraits in the National Gallery, but that's again been rebutted, that isn't true either. The fact that she appears as a sitter in 5 portraits in the National Portrait Gallery, people suggest that isn't true. It does appear on the internet. Her father was a clerk to the Insolvent Debtors Court and Clerk of the Rolls. So again, a respectable legal position, but they weren't not as high up in the English class system as Delamere's family. And they would have been frowned down on as well. The Delameres, he may have been principal at the Bank of England, but he still worked for a living, so he wasn't aristocracy. So interesting background. And he stayed with Elfrida for 40 years, and then she died in the 1940s, I want to say. And then he lived alone in the house after that. He didn't marry again or anything like that. And so one imagines that even though she was 10 years older than him, and talking about age gap, and he was young when he met her. So when you're 19, somebody who's 29 is a lot older than you, But seems to have been a happy relationship. He wasn't born with a silver spoon, maybe a plated silver spoon, but he actually worked for Standard Oil, and he was a statistics clerk at Standard Oil, and he worked there for 18 years, and he wrote at the same time. And then a guy called Sir Henry Newbolt, who was a poet, and who was very much into the confident imperialist British era, got him a civil list pension in 1908, so he could live off that and his writing and just write. So that was a tremendous thing. And he clearly impressed Sir Henry Newbolt, but, Delamere's a more subtle character in his view of the world. Let's think about because he wrote books and poems, like children's poems and things, but we're approaching it from his supernatural stories. He writes supernaturally famous poem, The Listeners, is a supernatural story, apparently written as a bedtime story for his children, and then that's disputed as well. This is what happens when academics get into it. Somebody says something, and then they find a minor fact that means that maybe there's a slight doubt on that, and then they put a big caveat in, this cannot be taken. It's just, what I think about academic career stuff, just pulling people apart to crawl over their corpses and some kind of dubious living. That was a bit harsh, really, but there we are. So Seaton's Aunt is his most celebrated supernatural story. And then his novel, The Return, 1910, which explores psychic possession without resorting to conventional explanations, is what we've been saying, leaving things open. In Seaton's Aunt, the aunt never appears as a ghost in any conventional sense. No spoilers there. Instead, she haunts the narrative through psychological presence. Her influence seems to extend across dimensions that rational thought cannot map. The works derive their power not from what they reveal, but from what they withhold. Explanations that would diminish rather than illuminate the mystery at hand. So I have said this publicly for the first time, that I think the great gift of supernatural fiction is, and I don't mean fantasy, and I don't mean science fiction and all the other genres, or the detective novel. I've said before how all these genres were spawned from Gothic fiction, from the 18th century Gothic and then 19th century Gothic story. All the genres that fill the bookshelves today. And, old Edgar Allan Poe has a lot to to be thanked for that. But they come from Gothic fiction. But what I would suggest, and I have said publicly, is that it is only supernatural fiction that allows you to be ambiguous. And if you look at modern horror, it has to me, something I don't like, which is the body part stuff, the vileness. I'm not saying I haven't done bits of that myself in my own writing, but I prefer these open-ended psychological things. I did that in. I wrote a story recently called The Monolith, and it went down well, and it's on the YouTube channel. And I deliberately didn't explain what had happened, and people liked the story. But a lot of people, yeah, but what happened? And it's this bow tying thing that people. So I think supernatural authors will withhold, will not explain. And I've gone, and I was thinking at the time, I was reading a book by Christopher Neve about painting, and I've been reading John Burgess stuff about. For some reason, I'm into visual art at the moment, even though, as I said, I can't paint or draw to save my life. And they don't have to explain it. There is no explanation, and I'm kind of playing with that idea, and I honestly think that supernatural fiction, maybe this is why I like it so much, offers that opportunity not to explain, but people, goodness me, they want an explanation, and they can get quite diggity. I don't know if that's a word. If you don't give them an explanation. Anyway, what I want to, and modern literature, genre fiction suggests that they set up mysteries, whether it's a detective mystery, a romance mystery. Do you have those? And then you solve them. Aha, you've got it solved. And I would say that this supernatural stuff has the opportunity not to do that. And I think the greatest Aikman, M.R. James, and E.F. Benson when he's on top form, and others, of course, really work because they do not explain, and we're left with this anxiety because, of course, it's what's called Zeigarnik tension, isn't it? So a loop opens, a question opens, and goodness me, our little human brains want to solve that problem, and we feel an anxiety until we do it, and that's what keeps us. That's what motivates us to keep going forward. I've got to solve this. I've got to find out. I've got to find out, because until it's resolved, it is a potential threat. And if you think about, I've often said about evolutionary psychology that I like it, but it is a lot of just so stories. It can't really be tested, so it's not really particularly scientific. But if you imagine that, you hear a crack, I used to see this in patients with anxiety all the time. It's about wanting to make sure the world is safe, so we have to have everything pinned. This is what's behind rituals of closing doors and ordering things and tidying things and having routines. It's all about minimizing surprise, because surprise, the unknown, is a threat. I'm not the only one to say this, and I've said it many times about modern psychology. I'm not going to go into. I've spent enough time talking about that, but anyway. So he doesn't do that and it creates this anxiety, and so certain people cannot tolerate that anxiety, and they want it to be bow tied off. Let's think about how that shades into modernism. So that modernism, the movement of the early 20th century, particularly, which was deliberately dismantling previous artistic assumptions in all sorts of art forms. I mean, you think of it was happening with surrealism and Dadaism and things like that. Even sort of the pre-Raphaelites and the Jugendstil in Vienna, and they were kind of breaking with previous ideas of art. I'm less certain of my art history than I am when I'm talking about stories, but I think it's true. And so modernism was, and you think of Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, people like this, who were deliberately subverting how books used to be written. So how does de la Mare fit in with this? So first of all, he's bracketed with the Georgian poets, so the poets that came before modernism, who were very conservative and predictable, and there were things that were done in certain ways, and they became very unfashionable as modernism advanced. But he started as a Georgian poet, but he later became W.H. Auden liked him, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, two massive modernists, were big fans of his poetry. So, although Georgian poetry was conservative, Eliot liked him. He's the great, almost high priest of modernism and the publisher as well. And he published de la Mare. So, I think the reason for that are some of the things that de la Mare uses that become central in modernism, and he pioneers them really: the unreliable narrator, the psychological fragmentation, the collapse of rational certainty. Although they were wrapped in traditional forms in his work, they are fully played out in the later modernist. But so he was like Hawkwind, right? So Hawkwind were a space rock band, still are, and they were not. They were kind of had similarities with Floyd, similarities with Zeppelin, but similarities with Deep Purple, but they weren't them. And then when punk came along, the punk said, "Oh yeah, we'll accept Hawkwind," because they, in much of what they were doing, they were prefiguring punk rock. Again, another. But I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. And things like the Sex Pistols were admirers of. I think old Phil Lydon, Johnny Rotten had been a roadie for Hawkwind, so that they were, and then of course, if you think of Motorhead as well, so then Lemmy goes forward and creates Motorhead, and if you listen to Motorhead, it is utterly fast and heavy. It's just like something like the Damned, and Lemmy actually guested with the Damned, so the Damned were absolutely punk rock, one of my fave punk rock bands actually. So so Walter de la Mare is a bit like Lemmy. Would they have got on? Difficult to see. If he drank Jack and Coke, then he probably would have got on with Lemmy. Apparently Lemmy was a really decent bloke. I never met him, but everybody said what a decent fellow he was. And by all accounts, nobody said anything nasty about de la Mare either. So there you go. So that he is, again, we've talked about how the late 19th century was the high point of rationalist scientific physicalism. That was the game in town, and a lot of supernatural fiction is written in an apologetic way against that. So either the supernatural is explained away, or it's kind of portrayed as, I mean, there's all sorts of currencies. This is why folk horror exists. It exists amongst country provincial peasants, but it's not what decent, normal, urban people think. Now, somebody like de la Mare is not doing that. He is not an apologist for is he an apologist for the supernatural? He doesn't apologize for it, is what I mean. He doesn't. He just says these weird things happen, and he doesn't cavil and he doesn't haver. He's just planting it right down. So it's an implicit critique of scientific materialism, which I think is fully blown now. I mean, I think scientific materialism, whatever you think, is on the run. There's Nobel Prizes being awarded for very strange things happening in quantum physics that kind of totally undermine. And of course, all paradigms change. Oh, what's his name? Kuhn in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, great book. The old paradigms, we never, so there's two ways of looking at the world. One is to say it's all explicable, and just give us enough time. And that's science, isn't it? Well, we don't understand this, but we will. So just go easy. I know it seems to contradict it, but we'll work it out. And we keep giving them this promissory note and going, yeah, cool, here you go, have some more time. And these things that they still don't solve, and it could be that they can't. So that leads us to the other view, is that as the microbe in my stomach depends on my Greg's pasty, it has no knowledge and cannot possibly understand the supply chain implications of how that pasty was made and how its life depended on it, And us as human beings, we're so, we are limited in our conception, in our brains and our sensory abilities. And so, why would we think we can comprehend everything in the universe, which is the implicit view of scientific materialism? Everything will be explained. We will have a theory of everything. We will know it all. I don't think you will. And I think this is what de la Mare is saying as well. What I like about de la Mare is his vibe. I like, if you listen to the listeners, just this haunted house vibe he has. It's really good. So absolutely, de la Mare does not provide comfort through explanation. And and he keeps mystery and numinous. He died in 1956, and his ashes were interred in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. Let's think about this story now. So this story is one of his latest ones, Bad Company. The beginning and other stories, published in 1955, just a year before his death, and the book gathered together a handful of new pieces alongside some previously unpublished material. We've done various stories on this thing. All Hallows. I haven't done Seaton's Aunt. Seaton's Aunt is 1909. It's a long time before that. All Hallows, 1927. We did the Quincunx. That's 1930 something. All Hallows 27. So this story, the tale begins in a London underground carriage where the narrator encounters an old man whose face is sheer unadulterated evil. So the first thing we get is the face of evil. That's the first thing he says before he locates it, before he puts us in that carriage. He says he's pondering about evil, and it is about nature of. It's a very simple theme, isn't it? The nature of human evil, how people can persist in wickedness. Now, what is evil? I remember having a debate, disagreement, that's the word, with my therapist about the nature of evil, and I can't remember what hers was. This is very awful that I say that, isn't it? You're only interested in your own ideas, Tony. To me, evil is about selfishness. It's about evil. If you look across society, something that's good is considered helpful to other people. When people do things for their own good and nobody else's, to the detriment of other people, they're considered evil. I think that's absolutely bang on straight. I don't think it's, to my mind, it's rock solid, that definition of evil. And this is what this man's done, really. But of course, then we get into the nuances. You know, the Buddha said, "What anger is like holding a burning coal to throw at somebody else. It actually burns you more than it burns them." And the lack of forgiveness. The whole work's on about the importance of forgiveness, because when you hold hatred, it burns you. And this is, I think it's a pretty simple, and this isn't really startling me saying that. That's a fairly commonly held belief. But this is what we see. This man has lived this grim, isolated, and his life is the grimness of his life is pictured in his house. It's dirty, it's isolated, it's cold, and in life, right up to the moment of death, he was still perpetuating his wickedness. That thing about giving his money to Scotland Yard is mad, isn't it? And he hates his poor sisters. He's stolen the money from them. Basically, they didn't get their fair share, and he's not going to give them the money now. But then, the implication is that the ghost after death, a bit like Marley's ghost in the Dickens story, he seeks out somebody who can help him redeem himself, and the redemption is that this vile will and letter does not get enacted, and then we presume that he had a bit of money left. He's the classic miser, isn't he? He doesn't even make himself happy with his connivances, and his theft from other people doesn't make him happy. I suspect this is all not true, actually. I think there are probably loads of happy thieves out there, but we like to believe they're not happy. And stories are about telling us how things should be, not how they are. And so here we are, how things should be. So, and I guess that the man's death will be found, and his heirs will be identified, and they will get his money. So I think he does a good thing. Just a couple of points, really. There's a lot to be said, and I'll probably run out of time, really. The urbanization of the uncanny. In his earlier stories, we did From the Depths as well, often unfold in semi-rural houses, schools, or landscapes on the edge of town. This is absolutely bang in the middle of the city, the underground, the city streets, the neglected terraced house. And I'm guessing this is the London, the post-war London. There's lots of gaps. You can see the river. There's going to be a lot of bomb damage that wasn't actually fixed, really, for up until the 60s. So, yes, it's far more urban. And de la Mare, I think, always has this compassion for other people. If we think of All Hallows and the clergyman or the guide he meets there, I think there's always this sense of sympathy for people. And even for this horrible old man in a horrible place, he finds empathy, and I think he's a good man. I think he's got all the right instincts. Let's think about briefly before we finish about the craft dimension of what he does. So it's a very simple story. You see somebody horrible, he appears to be following you. This is a setup. You could write a story like this right now. You just change the setting. But if you have a horrible person that you see and who follows you, because initially he's following him, that is going to set it up. It's like what I was saying about opening loops and opening questions in the reader's mind. A lot of these techniques are really simple and they work. They're just guaranteed to work. And you can create unease in your reader by doing that. And then, of course, the flip, this strange compulsion to follow him down these dark, horrible alleys. This is the equivalent of the horror movie where the protagonist is about to go into the cellar on their own. And you're like, don't do that. That's exactly what I had. Again, it's a very, every Hollywood low-budget film has done this. And so these are just guaranteed techniques. And then the atmosphere, the place. He's great about something about de la Mare's ability to conjure pictures in your mind. The snow's falling, and he sees this mid-Victorian terrace with the steps up. I was right there with him, And so I think that's the other thing to say. You don't just need narrative; you need a bit of description, because the description, using all your senses, puts somebody into the story with you. So I think it shows not. I don't think it's a massively innovative story. I think it's a late story. I think it works really well. I think it's a very competent story. I think the techniques he uses are tried and tested. I think he brings his own special ability to bring his vibe in. But the moral tale of the story, and I think most good ghost stories should have a moral tale, is that, even if you do evil in your life, you still have a chance to repent at the end, even as a ghost. And so I really liked it. I liked de la Mare. Some people find him a bit flowery to find his language, but I thought that this is far more pared down. I had a great comment. Somebody commented they'd been listening to one of the audiobooks, a big long one, I think, possibly Rebecca. And they go, boring. This just proves why I don't like books, And I thought, okay. Me. And of course, the final observation I have, just for you to take home with you, or you may be asleep now, which is probably a good thing. The observation is that everybody believes that their opinion is the one opinion that counts above all human experience and history. So if I believe Shakespeare was no good, it's my view, it is the correct view. If I believe the books are boring, it doesn't even, for people who comment, it doesn't even occur to them that it might be something to do with them, and you see this all the time. People, I didn't like that, and they pontificate about this. There's no humility there, like saying, well, for me it didn't work. That's legit. I'm not a big fan of Mozart, actually, but I accept that that might be me that's a bit deficient there, or not even deficient. It's just not my taste, and that's fine. And we smile and we shake hands, me and Mozart, and we go our opposite directions in good humor. But I'm not going to say Mozart, he's shit, But you hear that all the time, Shakespeare, he's shit, And I'm not saying it gets my goat, but just these people need to give themselves a shake, really. The book caught my eye. Stanislaus Lem, it's on my book, Solaris. What an amazing book. You go on Goodreads. I actually went on Goodreads looking for reviews of Bad Company. It's got a rating of 3.2 out of 5. And I think, who are you people? Who really are you people? You have the temerity and the hubris to say that, yeah, this is 1 star, this story. And reminds me of a story that I'm going to finish, honestly. My granddad told me. He said in Mareport, where we used to live, he said, if you start digging a hole in the ground, you will find during the course of the day, a lot of people will come up to you and tell you how you should be doing it, how you're doing it wrong and you should be doing it. And then a bit later, by the end of the day, you'll find out that none of them has ever dug a hole in their lives. But it's a human thing, isn't it? To have that arrogance to think that your view No nuances, no apologies, like it's my taste or it's my opinion or anything like that. I am right. Me, right for all time. I'm going to say something. It's satanic. It's Luciferian. It's a great sin. Actually, there's probably a ghost story in there, or a horror story in there somewhere. Anyway, I don't know why I went on so much. Nice day here, a bit cold, lovely, autumn. No, great. Thank you.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody comes back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?